Well, there's this, I don't know if you started to pick up on it, but there's a little bit of this tension going on between Paul and the Corinthians here. And it centers around these travel plans. And I know for some of us today, we're sitting here wondering, well, what on earth does that really have to do? We're going to talk about that in a moment. But these travel plans are plans that Paul had while he was on his third missionary journey, okay? And on this journey, he had intended, and what he's communicating within this passage, that he had this plan that he was going to travel from Ephesus, which if I had a red pointer, I should have come prepared for this, but if you see kind of the red section on the map there, Ephesus is on the very left side of it, right off the ocean, okay? And so he had been in Ephesus for about 3 months, and he had these plans that he was going to cross the water over into Achaia, which is that green section, and visit Corinth. And from Corinth, he was going to travel north up into the yellow, into Macedonia, and then come back down through Corinth on his way back to Judea, which is all the way over here in the bottom right. Those were the original, that was plan A. Okay, that's what had been, the expectations were for the Corinthians, that Paul was going to make 2 visits with them as he was traveling through their area. And well, what has come to pass is that Paul, in fact, didn't cross over the water there, but instead he traveled north and went up to Macedonia, down to Corinth, and then back up to Macedonia again on his way to Judea. So plans changed a little bit. And Paul writes this letter, and he's addressing this here and now, either recognizing that this change of plans has already created some tension, it's already created some conflict, where the church at Corinth is like, what gives, Paul? You know, why is it that you said you're going to do this, and now you're doing that, and why didn't you do what you said you were going to do? So either it's already happening, or Paul is preemptively addressing the situation, saying, I know this is going to be a point of contention. I know you're going to have questions, and so let me speak to these things. Because within Corinth, we had mentioned it last Sunday, is this group of individuals. These people had come to Corinth that later in this letter are going to be referred to as super apostles. And these individuals had come into Corinth, they started sowing some of this doubt. They started sowing some of this division between the Corinthians and Paul. They're asking some of these questions. Is really Paul, like is he really all that? Is he really someone that you should trust? Is he really someone that has your best interests in mind? I mean, after all, isn't this guy traveling all over the place? Why doesn't he stick around? Why doesn't he stay here? I mean, maybe in this moment you're saying, he said he was going to do one thing, but then he went to Macedonia first. Can you really take Paul at his word? And so there's some of this discord that's going on between Paul and the Corinthians, and we're going to see it kind of creep in throughout this letter. And Paul here addresses all of this, and we can sit here in Shabana in the year 2026 now and read about this tension. Read about this conflict that's going on between Paul and the Corinthians surrounding some travel plans from a missionary journey that took place about 2,000 years ago. And we can, in some ways, rightfully so, ask, what does this really have to do for us? Like, why does this matter to us? Why would we have any concern about these issues? Why would this make it into God's Word so that we would sit here on a nice Sunday morning in January and dedicate some time during a Sunday service to preach on this passage and talk about these problems? I mean, after all, you probably wouldn't be super fond of having your dirty laundry and conflict between you and a group of people aired 2,000 years later and have a group of sit down, let's dig into these problems, right? You'd be like, let's put the past in the past, okay? But the reality is these problems matter for us, not in that we need to be like, hey, you know, the travel plans and this and that, but what they show us is exactly what the book of Ecclesiastes teaches, that there's nothing new under the sun. Right? That if 2,000 years ago, when God's people were engaged in ministry, things would get a little bit messy, plans would change, conflict would surface, tensions would rise, then it's no different today. Right? If you've been in ministry, you've experienced this. If you've been engaged in things, you know that sometimes conflict's right around the corner, and it may not be malicious, but it's there, like having to call audibles with worship, in the last second. Right? Some of those things happen. And when they do, how is it that we're going to respond? Because if we are to engage in the ministry of the church, and that if your elders are going to call you as God's people to likewise engage in this ministry and to serve one another and to minister to one another, to minister to those in your life, then surely we need to know and recognize that we're not going to go in here and say, hey, by the way, if you're going to do this, life's going to be great. right? You're just going to have the most wonderful of experiences. Everything's going to go well because you're doing God's work, right? And if you're doing God's work, then surely there's not going to be conflict. Well, we would be deceiving you. The honest conversation is say, listen, we got to lock in. God's given us a mission. He's given us this privilege that we get to serve one another. We get to minister on behalf of the gospel. We don't deserve that, but God allows it for us, that He's given us this privilege. And by the way, when you do that, be prepared because plans are probably going to change. You're going to have to navigate some tensions and conflict. And so as we look at this passage, what we get the glimpse of is how is it that Paul and the Corinthians began to work through some of this conflict? Because I can relate with this. I can relate with the fact that plans change and there's conflict and there's tension. There's problems that you need to solve and address when you're living a life of ministry. That's real life. That's what happens. How do we go about it? And so when we're talking about this, the reality we said, the unfiltered reality about ministry is when ministry gets messy, we need to be mindful of a couple things. And the first that Paul points to within this passage is credibility. When ministry gets messy, and it will, be mindful of credibility. Now, I say that, and in the world that we are living in today, when we talk about being mindful of credibility, what jumps to our head is, well, what makes somebody credible? And for us, we've come to measure credibility based on someone's experience, based on someone's academics, the degrees that come after their name, because you're now an expert in that field. You're credible, right? You know what you're talking about. And frankly, that's not quite the credibility that we are talking about this morning. It's not quite the credibility that Paul is talking about here this morning. Instead, what he's doing is he's appealing, if you look down in our text with us, in verse 12, he appeals to this, their conscience. Right? He says, for our boast is this, the testimony of our conscience. What's that testimony? That we have behaved in the world with simplicity and godly sincerity. These things matter. Simplicity, again, what he's not saying with simplicity is that he's like, we've just been generic. When Paul's talking about behaving with simplicity, he's saying we've not been double-minded. We've not conducted ourselves. We've not conducted our ministry with ulterior motives. We've not said one thing and had a different purpose in mind. We've been honest. We've been forthright. Everything's been laid before you. That's the simplicity that Paul's talking about. We've been forthright. That we have nothing to hide. We're not trying to cover up something. And then he uses this idea of godly sincerity, speaking, more so. Have you ever taken like a $20 bill, or if you're maybe, I don't know, maybe you've used 100 or something, and you've had to take that bill up, and you have to figure out if it's authentic. You know what you do with it, right? You hold it up to the light, and you're starting to look for that security strip and all those things within it to make sure you're not holding the counterfeit 20 or something. Like that's the idea that Paul's talking about with sincerity. The word was used to convey this idea that something's been proven pure by holding it up to the light. So he's like, we've been examined. You can hold our ministry. You can hold our conduct. You can hold everything that we've said up to the light, and it's been found clear. It's been found pure. So what Paul is, in effect, saying about this credibility, first, he's like, we have a clear conscience. Right? He and Silvanus and Timothy, these guys that are missionaries, was like, we have a clear conscience. We have conducted ourselves in such a way that to our knowledge, we have nothing that comes to mind that we've done wrong. Right? In our world today, we call it living above reproach. So we live in such a way that nobody can bring an accusation against you. And that's exactly the idea that Paul is bringing in here. But then he moves from this idea of conscience at the end of verse 12, and he talks then about consistency. And he's like, we've got a clear conscience, and we've also been consistent in this, because at the end of verse 12, he says that we've done all this not by earthly wisdom, but by the grace of God, and supremely so toward you. In other words, what Paul is saying is, you've seen it. You, of all people, to the Corinthians, we've been with you. We've ministered with you. We've spoken with you. We've spent time with you. You know us. You know our hearts. You know where we're coming from. You know the authenticity that we're living with. And so that's the consistency that he's speaking about. So when he's saying, be mindful of credibility, he's not saying, go look for the degrees that are hanging on the walls. Paul is saying, be mindful of the credibility in the sense that it's that trust bank analogy, that you can go back, look at the banking history. That's what he's saying. You look back over time, look at all the deposits that we have put in our relationship, that we have invested in you, and the church in Corinth, right, over all these years. So here we are. And in essence, I think what Paul is doing is he's asking the church, won't you give us the benefit of the doubt? Won't you give us the benefit of the doubt? Because I recognize that plans have changed. And I recognize that change, we didn't meet your expectations, that all that. But can't you trust that we're not just trying to be deceitful and manipulative? Can't you trust, because you know us, that we have godly intentions in mind? We have your best interests in mind. You know that's our heart. That's what Paul's getting at. Now, one piece of advice that I received early in ministry was this proverb, if you will, that says that perception is reality. Right? Perception is reality. And what the proverb means is it's related to this whole live above reproach thing, that perception is reality and that what people perceive becomes true to them. Right? Whether or not that's true or not, what people see, what they perceive, will become reality for them. So live above reproach, right? All that goes into it. Now, what Paul is dealing with here is he's actually kind of confronting this idea that perception is reality. He recognizes that it's true. He recognizes that for the Corinthians, their perception was that he was being deceitful, that he was vacillating, right? You see, if we move along in our text here, down to verse 15 and 16, he's brought up these travel plans and the issues. And then verse 17, he says, no, was I vacillating when I wanted to do this? Do I make my plans according to the flesh, ready to say yes, yes, and no, no at the same time? Well, what Paul's saying is that surely as God's faithful, that's not the case. Our yes is yes and our no is no. We're not speaking out of both sides of our mouth. So perception is reality to the Corinthians, and Paul is challenging that perception. He's stepping in to that reality that the Corinthians have conjured up or are conjuring up, and he's saying, let me help clarify the perception. Let me speak to that reality just a little bit so that you can know and understand what's really going on and what is at stake here. And so the perception was Paul's wishy-washy. The perception is Paul is doing what Paul wants to do. He doesn't really care about us. The perception might be that Paul's just kind of this arrogant jerk that will just come in and slap you in the face with some hard teaching and tell you what's wrong, and he's gone, he's off to do other things and leaves you to pick up the mess, right? That's the perception. And throughout this whole section, Paul is helping clarify the reality that what you're perceiving and what you're feeling isn't true. He's explaining their heart in these things, helping them to see the authenticity. And then he goes on and he uses an example for this. So surely God's faithful. Our word to you has not been yes and no. But then in verse 19, he says, for the Son of God, Jesus Christ, whom we proclaimed among you, and he's Silvanus, Timothy, and I, right, was not yes and no, but in him it's always yes. You know, an initial reading as I was reading through this, I'm like, this just seems random, right? Like, why are we talking about travel plans and yeses and nos? And all of a sudden you've got Jesus thrown in here, and surely he wasn't yes and no, but he's always yes. Like, what on earth does this really have to do? What's Paul saying? And it's actually this really awesome and rich example that he's using for the Corinthians. And the example is meant to convey this, that just because something appears a certain way doesn't mean it's true. Right? So he's saying, I know what it looks like with our travel plans. I know what you're thinking, but those things aren't true. And here's the example, right? If ever there were a time in human history that a yes could have been perceived as a no, it would have been Jesus. Because here, what all this pulls to mind is Jesus shows up, and Jesus begins his ministry and his teaching. He's healing people. He's giving sight to the blind. He's raising the dead. He's turning water to wine. All these things, right? And people are beginning to believe Jesus really is the Messiah. He really is the one that the prophets have spoken of. He really is the promised one. Going all the way back to Genesis 3, like he's it, right? Jesus is really it. And people are getting excited about this, and people are rallying behind Jesus. And then Jesus goes to Jerusalem. You have Holy Week. You have Jesus arrested. He's tried. He's beaten. And he's hung on a cross. And he dies. I thought Jesus was the yes. And in that moment, all the people thinking that Jesus is the yes are like, it's over. He's a no. I thought Jesus was the fulfillment of all God's promises. I thought he was the Messiah, and now I'm standing here looking at a man hanging dead on a cross, just like that. Was Jesus both yes and no? What Paul is saying is, in fact, no. Jesus is yes. And it's in him that all of God's promises find their yes. Because that apparent no, where Jesus hangs dead on the cross and is put into a tomb, becomes the emphatic yes. The emphatic fulfillment, the emphatic place where God fulfills his promises to his people, going all the way back to Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, the first promise of the Messiah, that you will strike his heel, but he will crush your head. So, was Jesus both yes and no? Paul says no. He is, in fact, God's yes. That's the argument he's making. And so, what he's saying, he's using doctrine to help support and show and clarify their circumstance, right? Look, we all know that we saw Jesus, who we thought was a yes, go to the cross. We thought he was a no, and it turns out he is in fact yes. The no was never a no. And Paul is saying, listen, my apparent no of my travel plans and all of this that's going on is not actually no. It's actually yes. Right? He goes on and he'll explain some of this a little bit more. But we're going to get there in a second. So let me slow us down for just a moment, because before we move on to our next point, when ministry gets messy, it's important that we remember, be mindful of credibility. Be mindful of credibility, right? Because you're going to get into it at some point. There's going to be conflict between you and a brother or sister in Christ. And when that happens, you're going to have a choice to make. Will you trust in the intentions of that person, the track record of that person, that credibility, or in that moment, are you going to turn from them? And this morning, as we think through these things, we need to stop and think and recognize that there's going to be times when we're in Paul's shoes, and there's going to be times where we're in the Corinthian shoes. When you're in Paul's shoes, there may be a moment in your life, in your ministry, where you have to make a decision. You have to have a hard conversation. Your ministry will force you into a position where people are not going to always be super fond of those decisions that are made. You do them by building credibility, not in the moment of crisis, but now. Right? Paul doesn't, in this moment of crisis, start saying, well, look at all the things I'm doing right now. Paul, in the moment of crisis, looks back and says, look at all that we have. Look at the history. Look at the deposits that have been made over time, so that in this moment of difficulty, you've got a track record that you can trust. So if you're going to engage in ministry here and now, before the moment of crisis, make those deposits. Work with people, invest in them, care for them, love them, show them these things. Act and conduct yourself, behave in such a way that when the moment of crisis comes, you can say, look, you know my heart. You know where I'm at. We've been through stuff together. Trust me. On the other side, if you're in the shoes of the Corinthians, and that's going to happen at times, is where someone, maybe it's your pastor, maybe it's your elders, your church, or maybe it's a friend or someone you're serving in ministry with, they make a decision that you're not comfortable with. They make a decision that you don't like. They have a conversation with you that you're not exactly fond of. And the Corinthians have a choice here and now in reading Paul's letter to say, are we going to trust him? Are we going to give him the benefit of the doubt based on all the track record, based on the things that he's appealing to, or are we going to turn from him and leave him behind? This is the relational side of ministry that this passage is helping us begin to look through. Paul appeals to credibility. Now, we've got to keep moving because he moves from credibility. He also, then, if we look at verses 21 and 22, this is when ministry gets messy, be mindful of calling. Okay, and in verses 21 and 22, he says, and it is God who establishes us with you in Christ. He's anointed us. It is he who has put his seal on us and given us his Spirit in our hearts as a guarantee. Okay, now, there's a lot we could dedicate sermons to talking about the significance that's packed into these two verses. Because the richness of being established and anointed and sealed and given the Spirit as a guarantee, there's some great spiritual truths that Paul's talking about here. But he's making a point. And the point that Paul is simply making at this stage is to say this. You Corinthians, if you're going to discredit us, if you're going to write us off, there's an inconsistency in your decision to do that with who we are. And this is what that means. Paul is saying God's the one who's established us as he's established you. God's the one who has anointed us and set us apart as he's anointed you. God's the one who has sealed us as he's sealed you. So to discredit us is in some way, in the same token, to discredit God's work that he's done in your own life. And so when Paul's talking about be mindful of calling, he's not saying be mindful of calling in the sense that sometimes creeps into the church today, where we think that this idea of calling is authoritarian. I had to get my wording right there. That's like, hey, God gave me authority. God gave me leadership. Therefore, just do whatever I say because God said. That's not the argument that's being made. He's acknowledging the fact that God establishes, God anoints, God seals, all of those things, and God appoints leadership within the church. But he's using it in the same argument with the same things that God has done for the Corinthians to say, look, God's work is consistent. So if you're going to have difficulty trusting and having confidence in us, you at least can have confidence in God. Right? Because God's done those same things for you, and he's done them for us. So he's not coming out here just saying, trust me blindly, but saying, trust the work that God's doing. He's not just saying that we have carte blanche to do anything and to do everything. As a matter of fact, if you look down into verses 23 and 24, he refutes that very idea, because in verse 23 and 24, he says, I call God as witness against me. Right? Because you could come out of verse 23 and assume that what Paul is saying is, just do what we say. We're leadership. But in verse 23 and 24, he says, I call God as a witness against me. It was to spare you that I refrained from coming again to Corinth. Verse 24, right? Not that we lord it over you in your faith, but we work with you for your joy, for you stand firm in your faith. So he's saying, listen, God has established us. He's established you. Now, we don't use this authority for selfish reasons. We don't use this authority to lord it over you and to say, look, fall in line, folks. He's saying we use this authority to serve you. We use this authority to come alongside, to work with you. It's actually the word where we derive our English word synergy from, is to work with. That's what Paul is saying this authority, this leadership is really all about. It's actually for the good of the Corinthians. It's for their benefit, to partner with them for their joy. Not to just come and beat people over the head with a hammer and say, listen, God's given us authority. Because with that authority, Paul recognizes comes a lot of responsibility to care and shepherd and lead, to give an account for those things. So be mindful when ministry gets difficult, be mindful of calling. Whether you're in Paul's shoes or the Corinthians' shoes, we have a calling in Christ together. Together. All of us called together with him. And in moments, there's going to be times when you're in Paul's shoes, and you have to remember in the moments of difficulty, God's called you to lead and to shepherd, and he's given you authority, not to be selfish and ambitious and seek all your own interests, but he's given you that to serve for the betterment of the church. That may and will involve some hard things. You got to be willing to take those chips when they come. Likewise, on the other side, we've got to be willing to recognize that God's called people to lead. He's called people to serve, and their heart should be to serve for the good of the church. And that there are moments where we might need to trust them for that. To trust and see, look at that track record, look at all that stuff, and to consider the calling that God's put on their life, to not just to make everybody comfortable, not just to make everything fun, but to lead and do the spiritually hard work. That's what Paul's getting at here. And then finally, moving into our third point this morning, looking at these first 4 verses of chapter 2, that when ministry gets messy, be mindful of clarity. Be mindful of clarity. And here's where Paul takes some time, and he just puts his heart on the table. He's like, this is what's happened. This is why we made the decisions we did. This is why things shook out the way that they were. We recognized the plans were, we had plan A, we ended up going with plan B, and it wasn't to be manipulative. Here's why. He says, I made up my mind not to have another painful visit among you. So what Paul is starting with here is to articulate the fact that he and the Corinthians have been working through some things. He's had some hard conversations with the Corinthians. He said, right now probably wasn't the time for another visit. I'm going to give some time for healing. Give you guys some time to work on things. Give you a little bit of space. I'm going to come. I'm not writing you off, but now is not the time. There's some discernment. There's some pastoral care that Paul is showing towards the Corinthians in this instant. And he goes down and he talks about it, and he's down in the verse 4, right? I wrote these things out of affliction and anguish of heart. In other words, what Paul's saying is, I know we've had hard conversations. It's not at all because I like having the hard conversations. He's like, I had to write these things through tears. It hurt my heart to have those conversations. I didn't want to do that, and I didn't do it to cause you pain. I did it actually because I love you, and I love you enough that we needed to address these things. We needed to have those conversations. We needed to be honest about it because it wasn't good for you to continue in those ways, to continue down that path, right? That's what Paul's saying here. That's the conversation that he's having with the Corinthians. I know it's been hard. I know there's been difficulty. I know I've said some difficult and painful things, and I know it hurts. But you got to trust me that I'm not doing it with the intent to hurt you. I'm doing it really because I love you that much. I love you enough to have the conversation. I care about you deeply enough to tell you what's good for you, to address sins and faults and dysfunctions and whatever it is that he's dealing with the Corinthians at that particular time. That's his argument. And the clarity comes in when one side can communicate what's going on and the other side can listen to it and say, okay, we're going to understand. We're going to listen for understanding and for unity. Because what happens is a lot of times, and maybe you've been here before, in a moment of conflict like this, you sit there and in your head, you have all the conversations. You have the conversation with the person that you're in conflict with, and you go down all the rabbit trails. You have all the arguments, and you do it all in here. And in doing that, you put words in their mouth. You put assumptions and intentions in their heart that may or may not be true. And you sit in this, whatever this mode is, where you're not communicating, you're not listening, and you're just kind of sitting by yourself handling the conflict. And if you've been there, you know that you just stew on that stuff. I mean, that's where your blood pressure rises. You start judging motives and intentions. You say, well, so-and-so, they clearly, they just don't respect me. Clearly, they just don't care. Yeah, but they probably do. Maybe if you had a conversation, you'd understand what things are going on here. But there takes a humility to come to that table and to have the conversation on both sides. It takes a humility, if you're in Paul's shoes, to say, listen, we need to communicate. It can't just be that we come and say, well, this is just the way it is, get over it. A humility to be honest. A humility to own the things that are happening and say, this is why it happened, and to communicate. And on the other side, a humility to say, okay, I want to listen and I want to give you that benefit of the doubt. Instead of just saying, I hear what you're saying, but the preconception that I had in my head of your intentions and your motivations in your heart, that's gospel. Let's come to the table. Let's sit. Let's have the hard conversations. Let's be honest and learn to listen to each other. This stuff happens in ministry. Even we might think that this stuff happens in ugly and unhealthy ministries. This stuff happens in all ministries because we're all sinful. We're all growing, right? We're all in process. We're all being sanctified. But as last I checked, the best of pastors are sinful. The best of people in churches are sinful. The most devoted volunteers in a church, the most high-functioning leaders in a church, whatever, however you want to do it, we're all sinful. So conflict will arise. When it does, and when ministry gets messy, be mindful of these things. I'm not standing here to say that when conflict and ministry gets messy, that the credibility is going to all check out. I'm not saying that the calling's always going to check out. I'm not saying that it's always the clarity is going to clear things up. I'm just saying when the mess happens, and when it does, just slow down enough to be mindful of this stuff. And I bet the church will start to see a whole lot of mess get cleaned up pretty quick, if not headed off more times than not. See, guys, God's given us this really, really great blessing, this wonderful privilege that we get to serve. Like, we get to do ministry. I mean, you think about that. The God of the universe, the creator, almighty God, who doesn't need us, man, he's bestowed on us this great blessing that we get to minister to each other on behalf of his word. We get to engage in life with one another and sharpen each other and encourage one another and support each other. He's given us the responsibility to carry one another's burdens and to address sin in each other's lives, not to pound each other over the head, but to spur each other on to holiness and to love the Lord and to serve him with our lives. I mean, this is a blessing. But that blessing comes with hard work that's involved. So I just appeal to you today. God's given us something pretty incredible. And just because that as we engage in it, we might face some messiness, we might face some conflict and have to work hard and have, just because all those things come with it doesn't mean that it's not rich in meaning and fulfillment. Maybe it's because of those things that it's so rich, it's so meaningful, it's so much a blessing that God allows us to do these things. So I appeal to you, just engage in ministry. Whether or not you're serving in some sort of a role where you've got responsibility that comes with that, or you're just as an everyday person ministering to other people, minister with your heart, man. Put your heart into the ministry that God's given you and do it with all your being. Find the blessings that God has in store for it.